to find the criminal conspiracy.
Okay. I'm just given. I was just given a note by the Secretary of State saying that we're very close to a deal in the Middle East.
That was the moment, live on camera, in the middle of a meeting, Donald Trump was told that Israel and Hamas were close to agreeing what Donald Trump would then describe as a peace agreement. This happened in Egypt on Wednesday night. And on this latest episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast, we will work out what the two sides have agreed to, how Israelis and Palestinians are feeling about it, what's going to happen in the next few days, the next few months, and maybe even the next few years as a result. So that's what you'll hear on this latest episode of Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and we're going to focus on the momentous events around the Israel-Gaza conflict of the last 24 hours. Israel and Hamas look like they have agreed part of a ceasefire deal, which includes the release of the remaining Israeli hostages in return for Palestinian prisoners being held in Israel. We will also see a massive influx of aid into Gaza, but there's lots of elements of Donald Trump's so-called peace plan that the two sides haven't agreed on yet. This is the start or the middle of a process rather than the end. So let's look at all the details. Let's look at what we know, what we don't know, and how people across the world are reacting to all these big decisions. First of all, we're going to speak to Lise Doucette. We spoke to her earlier on this week when she was in Tel Aviv in Hostage Square, and she's there right now where it sounds like actually it's all revving up. Lise, what's going on?
Hello, Adam. I join you tonight from Hostage Square, where the mood has been utterly transformed. Just two days ago, it was really somber. People were daring to hope that a ceasefire could be in reach. And this square, even in the dead of night, in the early hours of the morning, was filled with people who were dancing and singing and celebrating that at long last, the last of the Israeli hostages would soon be coming home. And I should warn you that a big concert is about to get underway, but we have time, I think, for a conversation before it does.
Yeah, and we should just say that the scenes that you're witnessing just now prove that it's not just the families and friends of the hostages who are overjoyed at this news. It is a huge chunk of Israeli society.
That is what the opinion polls show, Adam. Month on month, a growing number of Israelis agree that it was time to end the war, to end the military operations by the Israeli forces, to prioritize bringing the hostages home. Prime Minister Netanyahu kept saying that military pressure was helping, but the reality was, and what the hostages were saying, or the families of the hostages were saying, is that while the war continued, every day longer was a day of risk that their loved ones would not come home alive. And now, as we speak, the Security Cabinet is considering the ceasefire deal, which was hammered out in recent days in the Egyptian Red Sea resort of Sharm el-Sheikh. Once that deal is passed, then goes to the full cabinet, a ceasefire will come into force, and then the process of releasing the last of the hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners will get underway. And throughout the day, when we first came here this morning, there was a smattering of people, and now every hour the crowds get bigger and bigger, and you can just see it's absolutely packed now. They've been singing and dancing and singing the Israeli national anthem, waving American and Israeli flags throughout the day.
And that's Lisa and I are talking at about 6 UK time, so a little bit later in Israel, and that's the situation at the moment. Also, Lisa, the fact that there are American flags there suggests that people are giving Donald Trump a lot of credit for this.
They are, and I spoke today to a number of the organizers who are part of what is called the Hostages and the Missing Forum, and they have been an extraordinary group of people who came together very early on to provide some solidarity and to raise their voice together to call for the hostages to come home. Week after week, month after month, they filled not just the square, but the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem in ever greater numbers, calling on Prime Minister Netanyahu to do the deal. They've also traveled the world over, including to Washington, to urge world leaders, most of all President Trump, to focus on this deal, to put pressure on the Israeli government as well as Hamas. And what we saw in recent days is President Trump, who seemed to have been very moved by the agony, by the pain of the hostage families who visited him and the released hostages who visited him in the White House, he started posting photographs of this very square packed with people with big banners saying now or never. And he started focusing on Israeli public opinion to say, I hear you, and I'm going to do everything I can to bring the hostages home. It was a real turning point, Adam. And so there's a sense, not just of relief, but of satisfaction. They finally got President Trump's ear.
And at least some of this might be superseded by the time newscasters are actually listening to this after we've been speaking now. But are the signs then that the hardliners in the Israeli government, who in the past would have blocked a deal like this, are actually willing to go along with it?
No, they're not going to go along with it. They've made it absolutely clear. Some of the far right-wing ministers, the national security minister, the finance minister, they don't like this deal. They want the war to continue. They've accused Prime Minister Netanyahu of selling out. They say they will vote against it. But they're from what we see now, they're in a minority. And while there may be heated discussion, we expect that the deal will be approved by the Security Cabinet and then by the full cabinet. And if these ministers then pull out of the government, other politicians from other parties have made it clear to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and in fact some of them say they were asked by the White House whether they would provide a safety net for Prime Minister Netanyahu to keep his government alive if others pull out, and they said yes, we will do that.
And Lisa, all the headlines are about what has been agreed. There's a bit less focus today on what has not been agreed, because of course this was originally one big package, and lots of parts of that package have not been agreed by both sides.
Yes, and I suppose because I'm in Hostages Square, we're focusing on the Israeli celebration, and I think we should emphasize that there have been celebrations too in the Gaza Strip, that the people took to the streets, explosion of joy in the early hours of the morning in the dark, in the ruined streets, in the rubble. People were absolutely relieved that the war had stopped. They know that there is still so far to go before they can start rebuilding their lives. But just to know that the bombardments will stop, that they will no longer live every day as if it will be their last because of the very real threat, either from Israeli bombardment or from being caught in those crowds in Israeli gunfire as they go towards the food distribution centers of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. On both sides, on the side of Israel and Hamas, they have committed to follow their part of the deal. Israel to pull back to 53% of the Strip. Hamas has also agreed to release all of the hostages. But what we don't know there are still really, really difficult decisions to be taken. Those issues are still on the table. Will Hamas agree to disarm? Will they agree to go into exile? Who will run the Gaza Strip? Will Israel agree to pull back completely from the coastal enclave? And what about what was vaguely described in President Trump's 20-point plan as the political horizon for the Palestinians? For Palestinians, for many the world over, including in London, that means a Palestinian state. And that is something the Israeli government, most of all Prime Minister Netanyahu, have flatly rejected. But those are decisions for tomorrow. The emphasis now is on starting the first phase of this deal and then to keep the process going. There is a risk it could start unraveling, but huge international momentum is now behind it. And there will be many who will try to keep President Trump's focus on this deal, and they'll press home that point. We expect that he's going to travel to this region, from what we know now, visiting Israel, possibly also visiting in Egypt, and he will see the impact of his intervention, what an impact it has made on the ground.
And I suppose, Lise, we should remember, and I don't want to be a downer here, but there was a time where there was a ceasefire in place and hostages were being released and people were hopeful that this was an end to the conflict, and it wasn't.
Yes, January the 19th, the day before President Trump was inaugurated for a second term into the White House, a ceasefire came into effect. There was cautious optimism. There was the same kind of celebrations. Some of the hostages came home. Hundreds of prisoners were released. And then in March, it all broke down. Prime Minister Netanyahu pulled out, saying that there was now a new deal on the table, that Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy, had a new deal, even though Steve Witkoff had been very involved in the deal, in the ceasefire, which was in force. And so the military operations started again. The Israelis then cut off all food and water and essential supplies coming into the Gaza Strip. The government is accused of using starvation as a weapon of war. Israel denied it, and it was under huge international pressure that it started to resume the aid, but through that Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And it bears mentioning that the allowing far more aid into the Gaza Strip, hundreds of trucks every day, 400 trucks every day initially, is also a key part of this deal.
Well, Lise, thank you very much. And I can hear some speakers revving up in the background, so I think that concert might be about to start. So very good that we could speak to you before you got drowned out. So thank you.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary moment, Adam. It's just palpable. You can feel the joy here, even though some people say we're holding our breath until it happens, until we can actually see our loved ones. And for Gazans, they have been let down so many times before. But this is an extraordinary moment, and there's hope against hope. Listen to this. Listen to the cheering now that this time it will move forward and not back.
Yeah, I can just pick that up even just in my little earpiece that I'm wearing in this studio to talk to you. Lise, thank you so much.
Thank you, Adam. Good to talk to you.
Right, let's pick up on some of those things because we're joined from Washington by BBC News chief presenter and friend of Newscast, Sumi Sumiskanda. Hi again, Sumi.
Hey, Adam.
And also on the line from Panorama is Jane Corbin. Hi, Jane.
Hello, Adam.
So, Jane, it's quite hard to work out exactly what's going to happen next. I suppose, well, we know what's going to happen next as we're recording this. It's the Israeli cabinet approving this deal. But then what's your take on what the stages will be after that?
Yeah, and it's reckoned it's still hanging in the balance as we're speaking, but they are believe that they will approve it. The deal is that then within 24 hours, Israeli forces will draw back. They're not leaving Gaza altogether, which was a key demand of Hamas from the start and something that Benjamin Netanyahu and his government resisted. And they seem to have won that argument. They're going to pull back within 24 hours. And then within 72 hours, we should see the release of the hostages. That takes us to sort of Monday, Tuesday. And President Trump has said Monday, Tuesday, he would expect to see hostages finally released and coming out of Gaza. And I think we can reckon that if we see President Trump getting on a plane and coming to Israel, coming to the Middle East, that will be a very clear sign that at last this thing is on track for those hostages to be released, for the ceasefire to hold, and for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners to be released as well in exchange for the hostages.
And Jane, we've talked about this before, that releasing the hostages and transferring them back to their homes isn't just a case of Hamas sort of clicking their fingers and it's done. It's quite a complicated process within Gaza.
Yeah, and, you know, I've covered many hostage release scenarios over the years, and that is the real danger point, the release, because perhaps some want them to go and some don't. There's always tensions. We don't know exactly where Israeli forces will be vis-a-vis where the hostages are coming out from in Gaza, because Israeli forces will still be there. And of course, we know that it's not just Hamas, but Palestinian Islamic Jihad who is holding some of the hostages. So it's not as simple as Hamas, rounding them up and bringing them all out together. They may be held by different groups, different factions. That's the live hostages. It's believed to be about 20 are still alive. And then there are the bodies of, it's believed about 26 hostages. There are 2 unaccounted for. And that, I think the bodies will be a longer process, because it's been intimated out of Gaza that Hamas doesn't actually know where all the bodies are. So producing those bodies is going to be very difficult. And we've had instances in previous releases of bodies where they haven't been the person that Hamas says they are. And this has caused even worse heartache for the families, believing that they've received back a body, which it turns out is not their loved one. So it's a really complicated, really fraught, really difficult situation.
And of course, some of the Palestinian prisoners being released from Israeli detention, that's quite a difficult thing to swallow for some Israelis.
Very difficult. And some of the key names on the list have been Palestinian prisoners who've been inside for a long time, accused of murder, convicted of murder, some of them. And amongst them, very important figures like Marwan Barghouti, who is one of the West Bank leaders of Fatah. He's been inside for decades, and he was high on Hamas's list. He was in, he was out. We don't quite know whether Marwan Barghouti will be released or not, but it seems that the Israelis have stood firm against his name. So I think that's very much still hangs in the balance, and that is not a done deal yet.
And Sumi, I think of myself as quite world weary, and it's rare that I wake up, turn on the radio and go, wow. But this morning was one of those moments. But I suppose you guys in DC saw this all unfolding in real time while a lot of us in the UK were asleep, because there was that moment where Trump was in the middle of a meeting and he got handed a note saying, this deal is on or about to be on if you make it happen.
Yeah, and can I just express my deep admiration for Lise Doucette, who was on with us in the middle of the night in Tel Aviv at, I think, 2 or 3 in the morning, and has not gone to sleep since, and was delivering, of course, that same precise, insightful analysis at that hour. But we were running through that. And in fact, Tom Bateman, who's our State Department correspondent and spent several years in the Middle East as the correspondent for the BBC, he came into the studio and he said, did you just see that? This note was passed to President Trump. And it's interesting, in the past, it really shows that the change of communication style of this White House, doesn't it? That in the past, if that kind of note or conversation was had where you see the Secretary of State kind of leaning over and speaking to the president, you might have seen the president, get up or leave the room, or perhaps share the note with another cabinet member. Instead, the president turned right to the camera and said, that was, Marco was just telling me we're very close. So that transparency that we've seen throughout this Trump administration. And again, what did that note say? It said, we have a social media post for you to approve. And again, the communication style of this White House being that all of this foreign policy and domestic policy, for that matter, is communicated directly on Truth Social, President Trump's social media platform. But it was one of those extraordinary moments, really. And we had a sense after the several hours of negotiations that there was real momentum. President Trump kept saying, we're getting very close, very close. And indeed, we were kind of gearing up to that moment. And we had Tom with us kind of on standby, understanding that any moment it could happen. And then it popped up on Truth Social. And from there, we just kind of went on with analysis for hours. But there was a real sense of relief here in Washington. And this piece of good news, of course, if the ceasefire agreement holds, is one that many here are saying, look, this has to be attributed to President Trump and his power.
And in terms of why they think it's worked this time round after many attempts, what's the White House's, what does the White House feel the key was this time?
Well, the White House would say this is, President Trump's ability and his let's say, relationships with the Israeli prime minister, with the leaders in the region of Qatar, of Egypt, of the Gulf states, that was able to push this across the line. Many of the analysts I've been speaking to have said what has changed this time, and I know you were speaking with Lisa a little bit earlier about the ceasefire agreement that fell apart earlier this year, is the circumstances. There is really the sense, and our partners at CBS News have reported as well, that one of the real turning points was when the Israelis struck Doha, trying to attack Hamas leadership there, that really changed the equation for the Trump administration, for the president, who expressed real frustration with the Israelis. And, there is a sense that now was the time for this to get done, to push this forward. And, from January until now, we have also seen a real shift in President Trump's position as well. Of course, President Trump is a very pro-Israeli president, his cabinet members as well. But, in the past several months that we've seen this incredible devastation in Gaza, the starvation as well, and the fact that the attempt to militarize aid, as we know, through the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, this Israeli and U.S.-backed aid foundation to deliver work that clearly did not work and saw hundreds of Palestinians shot near or at aid distribution sites, that there had to be another solution and way forward. And Adam, this, and Jane as well, and Lise, who was on with us, the framework that President Trump introduced, that 20-point plan, is not very different at all from what the Biden administration introduced. But what's different now is the circumstances, and I should say, President Trump's pressure.
And Jane, that timeline that Sumi was just giving there is such a reminder that in diplomacy in general and in the Middle East in particular, it's never just one thing. It's a combination of things that change over time.
Yeah, and as Sumi said, there isn't a huge amount of difference between the Biden plan, back more than a year now, and the Trump plan. But what's changed is the circumstances. That Israeli strike on Doha, and only a month ago in September in Qatar, which actually killed the son and the chief of the office of Hamas, of the chief negotiator, who is now negotiating this, that was a turning point and a miscalculation, it's generally believed, by Israel. President Trump was furious. Qatar is a big American ally. The big American airbase at Al Ubaid is just outside Doha. The Americans were not warned in advance. They were only told as the Israeli attack began. It was a miscalculation, but what it enabled President Trump to do was to exert pressure on Mr. Netanyahu quite firmly. And we even saw him pushing and forcing, effectively, Netanyahu to call the Qatari prime minister and apologize. And Trump was in the room. So that it really, really changed the calculation. And President Trump was prepared to do what President Biden had not been prepared to do, which was to pressurize the Israeli government. And that, I think, has been a key factor in where we've got to today.
And Sumi, do we know for definite that Trump is going to go and visit Israel this weekend, or is that conditional on certain things happening? And why is he sort of swooping in at this point?
We understand from the White House that the planning is well underway, so it seems all but certain at this point that the president will go to the region. And, he wants to be seen on site. We understand he wants to take part in a signing ceremony of sorts in Egypt and then visit Israel as well. We know that the Israeli prime minister, after the announcement was made on Truth Social of the ceasefire agreement, had a phone call with President Trump in which he invited the president to speak in front of the Israeli Knesset as well. And that's something that apparently the White House has said that he is considering. So that might be part of this trip. But look, this is really a crowning achievement for President Trump. It's one that he is eager, of course, to say that he had a central part in. And the reality is that he did. And for him to be able to stand alongside the negotiators, alongside, his ally, the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and sign this agreement, that is, of course, putting his rubber stamp directly on this agreement. And in a way, also kind of making very clear that this agreement cannot fall apart in the next stages of negotiations. That is not to say that it won't, but him being there is a real sign that his expectation is that all parties here must continue to make sure that this deal holds.
And Jane, I mean, this bit of the process has been very hard. The next bits are even harder. Getting enough aid in, getting Gaza not even rebuilt, but just sort of stabilized, making sure nothing goes wrong and there aren't any mistakes that jeopardize the rest of the timeline, creating a transitional kind of political or non-political, technocratic authority to run Gaza, let alone whatever happens after that.
Yeah, I mean, not only has aid got to be surged in, and they're talking about 400 trucks a day, and actually that's a minimum requirement. They need more than that. I mean, most of the UN agencies have said today they stand ready to surge, WHO and UNRWA. But, as well as aid and, the terrible state that those people of Gaza are in, who've living in tents, who've all, especially in the last few weeks, been forced to leave now the north, as well as the situation that the population of Gaza is in, there are huge question marks, even about Hamas, demilitarizing Gaza. I mean, there seems to be an understanding that Hamas has agreed to give up its heavy weapons as part of this deal and the 20-point plan, but not its small arms. It needs to, or it believes it needs to keep those. That is something that Mr. Netanyahu has said cannot happen. There has to be complete demilitarization of the Gaza Strip. So, even that is uncertain. The aid situation is uncertain. These are just for tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, let alone what happens in a week or a month when we talk about stabilizing Gaza and bringing in some form of technocratic government, which also isn't decided. So, these are huge questions. And I think that it's going to be sequenced. First of all, the hostages coming out, the Palestinian prisoners released, but then what about Hamas? They've been offered security guarantees by America that the war won't start again and safe passage out. These things still have to be worked out.
And I suppose, Sumi, as we've learned with President Trump, he can be very engaged with something and put lots of effort in and get results, but then he can be very engaged with something very different a few days later.
That is true. And he certainly has plenty on his agenda. Of course, there is the war in Ukraine that is continuing, that, of course, President Trump has said has turned out to be the most difficult conflict for him to address. And President Trump isn't necessarily involved in all of the details of the negotiations that have been going on in the last few days. That's why he sent his mediators, his Middle East special envoy, Steve Witkoff, his son-in-law and close aide, Jared Kushner. He is quite eager to move this forward. But the reality is that the pressure is going to have to continue from the Trump administration. That isn't to say that President Trump won't be involved. And again, I think it's important to underline here, I said earlier, the circumstances have changed from the last ceasefire agreement. It's also important to say that it is President Trump's ability to put pressure on Hamas and on the Israeli prime minister that really pushed this forward and pushed the momentum forward to a point that we've gotten to this ceasefire agreement. Now, the question you're asking is, will that momentum continue with President Trump? Yes, there will be other items on his agenda, especially domestic items, with so much happening here in Washington and across the country. But you do get the sense that this is one where the administration is going to have to invest considerable time and resources for the negotiations in the coming days and weeks. We'll see how that is done. The special envoy, Steve Witkoff, has been deeply involved in negotiations on the war in Ukraine as well. So it might be that is what he moves to next. But for the time being, this is going to have to be, kind of the principal players of the Trump administration who brought it to this point will have to continue to stay on this.
And Sumi, there's all these claims that the reason Donald Trump is so invested in this at this point is because we're about to have the announcement of who's going to win the Nobel Peace Prize this year and that he would like it to be him. What's a way of thinking about those claims and how seriously we should take them?
Yeah, I mean, we have to say, of course, President Trump has made no secret about the fact that he believes he should win the Nobel Peace Prize. And we've seen a number of world leaders say, including the Israeli prime minister, that he should as well. And I was mentioning earlier that to someone that we saw the Ukrainian president, Zelensky, say, if the president is able to secure a ceasefire for Ukraine, I will go nominate him as well. Look, this is something that is important to the president. The timing, yes, we're going to see the announcement of the Nobel Peace Prize. Remember that the nominations for this year's prize actually closed much earlier in the year, so unlikely to be President Trump this year. But if this agreement holds and the ceasefire holds, and we actually do see a pathway towards, governance in Gaza that involves Palestinians, all of the things that this 20-point framework has in it, you would say that President Trump is certainly a contender for next year. And that's something that you have to say President Trump is interested in and cares about. So, yes, the timing is this week. It is also the week of October 7th and the October 7th anniversary. There are so many kind of pieces of symbolism to this week that I think we have to take into account.
And Jane, this is a really hard question for you to end on, so I apologize for that. But it's just about helping us put this in perspective. And what I'm getting at is all through the last couple of weeks, I've been thinking, should we call this a peace agreement or is it like a ceasefire negotiation? And the BBC's kind of collective decision is that if we're reporting on somebody and they call this a peace agreement, we will attribute it to them and say, oh, President Trump called this his peace agreement. But we don't describe it as that. I'm just wondering, what should we be thinking of this as? Obviously, it's a big moment, but it's not it's not the end, is it?
A ceasefire is not a peace agreement. It's not the end of a war, is it? I mean, look at Korea. Between the Koreas, there was a ceasefire. The Korean War was never actually officially ended. Here, we've got a situation where we have a ceasefire. We hope that's going to lead, progressively to peace. But I've been reporting on this area for 30 years, and it's always been a peace process. There's never been really a peace agreement. There have been accords along the way. Unfortunately, none of them has really stuck, although obviously the one between Egypt and Israel did, Camp David. But it's, I think, a process. It's a ceasefire and a process. And if we're going to call it a peace agreement, then we have to attribute it, because that is Donald Trump's description. But, following on from what Sumi said, if the next year things do progress, then it is a big, big achievement for President Trump. And, he would be, well, I think, in line to claim that he should have the Nobel Peace Prize. I've watched a whole string of US presidents fail to bring peace. President Clinton, President Obama, President Bush, two Bushes, actually, President, and now we've got President Biden and now President Trump. So this is a battlefield on which presidential reputations have been destroyed, and presidents have expressed extreme frustration and walked away from it. So if President Trump can bring this about, whatever you want to call it, ceasefire for now, peace process, perhaps a peace agreement, then I think it will indeed be an enormous achievement.
Right. Perfect place to end this episode. Jane, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Adam. Thank you, Sumi.
And Sumi, thank you too.
Thanks for having me.
Now for something completely different, because as part of Newscast's coverage of the party conference season, we're now going to hear the interview I recorded on Thursday morning with the leader of Plaid Cymru, the party of Wales. He is the former BBC journalist, Rhyn ap Iorwerth, and I spoke to him down the line from the BBC in Cardiff, his old office, in fact. Rhyn, welcome back to Newscast.
Good to be with you again.
To my shame, I've never been to a Plaid conference, so can you just set the scene for what they're like for me?
I mean, I enjoy conference. It's an opportunity to do the politics and to share policy and to share ideas and to share vision. It's also an important opportunity for you to come together as party activists and people who want to put that vision into action and to pick up ideas, how things going in your patch, how things going in yours, and so on. So, I mean, they're always a positive affair, but I think it's fair to say that there is more expectation and hope and a real sense of opportunity going to be felt in Swansea this weekend.
Well, yeah, because the UK-wide party conferences, which have come to an end, have felt a bit kind of, oh, well, there's a long way to an election, so what happens here is of limited importance. But actually, for you guys, the Senate elections are a few months away. It's next May.
Yeah, party conference seasons do go in phases. I remember as a journalist, I think I covered 5 party conferences in 1 year once. And certainly when they are after a UK general election, the UK conferences, there's a feeling perhaps of rebuilding or consolidating. But it is very much the opposite here in the Welsh political cycle. Here we are 7 months away-ish from what is set up to be a historic Welsh general election in May next year, with an opportunity for change of the kind that we've never seen in Welsh politics before. So this is very much on the up. And for a party that currently is leading the opinion polls, you would expect there to be a rolling up of sleeves and preparing for that sort of last big push up to May next year.
Yeah, and the reason it seems so historic is because Labour, who historically have dominated Welsh politics, have been slipping further and further down the polls, and you and Reform have been going up and up and up. What do you think is driving that?
I think there are a host of issues coming together here. We could see the signs of growth in Plaid Cymru before the last general election. We had the best ever UK general election result in the history of Plaid Cymru last year, which set us up for where we are now. But of course, Labour came in with something of a whimper, and Keir Starmer, though with that huge majority, then progressed to implementing things or not implementing things which seemed to run contrary to expected values of the Labour Party. And that has been picked up on very much by what have been loyal Labour supporters in Wales. There's huge disappointment there. At the same time, there was a Welsh Labour government in Welsh government, tired after 26 years running Welsh government, and failing time and time again to stand up to Keir Starmer to say stop. Don't take it out on the most vulnerable in society. Take some progressive steps, and also on issues like fair funding for Wales and rail funding for Wales, where we needed to be taking a stand as a country. Labour in Wales chose loyalty to their party bosses in London over the well-being of the people of Wales. Then you have things like Port Talbot and the steelworks and the fact that Labour let people down, all come together with a positive feeling towards Plaid Cymru. And we're seeing this major shift in politics, coupled, of course, with the global phenomenon that is the growth of the populist right, and Wales is no exception to that. But we can stop that in Wales.
Well, and what do you think it is about Wales that so many people are flocking to reform? What kind of people with what sort of lives are thinking reform is the answer?
Well, to be honest with you, I think the pattern in Wales is very similar to the global pattern in many respects. Reform isn't special, and if it wasn't reform, it would be somebody else. But we're seeing it everywhere, from the United States to European countries to South America and so on. This is a global phenomenon that those of us on the progressive side of politics have to take a stand against and show that there's a real alternative. So all we have in Wales is the example of that happening here too. The difference that we have in Wales currently is that in England, we are seeing reform pulling ahead of the old guard of Labour Conservatives. We'll see how long that lasts, but for the time being, they're able to put some gap between themselves and Labour and the Tories. In Wales, because of the presence of Plaid Cymru, a party that celebrated its centenary this year, we've been there at the heart of Welsh politics for a long time. People know who we are, and they are seeing us as an alternative on that progressive side of politics that we don't have. If we want to throw out the old guard, we don't have to opt for the populist right. So Plaid Cymru offers that alternative, and it feels as if people are seeing what that opportunity represents.
Now, your tone when you talked about reform, you were scathing about them, but isn't that being scathing about the people who are tempted to vote for them? You're sort of suggesting that people who are tempted to put a cross in the box, although of course you've got a different voting system in Wales, so I mean that metaphorically, for reform. You're sort of suggesting that they don't really know what they're voting for, or that they might be a bit stupid. Is that a very wise thing to do?
No, I'm glad that you're asking the question in that way, because it's an opportunity for me to say, no, that's not at all what we're saying. We can see what the growth of the populist right looks like globally. I can see worryingly where that is heading. It's not about tarring people considering voting reform with that. It's about saying that's what the reform project is. And my argument is to people who are considering to vote reform, stop and think genuinely what they represent. Do you really understand that this is a party that, quite apart from sowing divisions and needing divisions and pitching neighbour against neighbour in order to thrive, but do you really want a party that votes against workers' rights, that talks openly about privatising the NHS, that talks openly about the possibility of getting rid of our democratic institution, the Welsh Parliament, and silencing Wales's voice and bringing back direct Westminster rule?
Well, hang on though. You know it is not reform policy to privatise the NHS. Some people in reform have talked about different funding options in the past, but it's not reform policy now. And also, would they seriously be abolishing a democratic institution that they're probably about to become one of the largest parties in?
And I also hear Nigel Farage saying that I don't want to privatise the NHS, but I've also seen and heard him for a very long time talking about the benefits of introducing an insurance-based health system. That's what they've got in America, where people are unable to afford healthcare and suffer the consequences of that. And it's always the vulnerable who pay the price for that. So we have to be very, very aware of what their trajectory is. These are the new ultra-conservatives now, the conservative establishment under Nigel Farage. And on
a party that wants to get rid of the two-child benefit cap?
this is a party that will say whatever it thinks is the expedient thing to say. I think that's our experience from reform, and that's also true on the question of the future of the Senedd. And Nigel Farage has decided that it's politically expedient, because Wales supports having a national democratic voice, to say we'll keep it. But their most senior politician in Wales, who is a member of the Senedd, didn't win a seat as reform, but came over from the Conservatives to reform, has openly said that we should think about getting rid of the Senedd. That is their most senior member in Wales. Now, I'll just listen to what I hear from them and reflect on that, and that's all I'm asking the people of Wales to do too.
Now, this interview is turning into a Keir Starmer conference speech where we spend 90% of it talking about reform rather than your party. So let's reverse that now. Tell me a bit more about the Plaid platform for this next election. I mean, when will we see your full manifesto, for example? Yeah, and I'll make the point that I started by talking about Plaid Cymru's vision and what we're going to be discussing at the conference this weekend. True. Fair enough. Hold my hands up.
That's really important.
Hold my hands up.
And I think we, as I say, have a historic opportunity to embrace a different way of running Wales, a party that is focused on Wales's interests and isn't split between loyalty to the people of Wales and a party in London. So we can focus on putting together a manifesto, which will be out in early next year. But of course, the work that's being done for that manifesto is well into maturity. We've talked about a number of the policies that we will be putting into place, getting to grips with child poverty in Wales, something that Labour has singularly failed to do, getting rid of their targets on child poverty. We will introduce a pilot for a direct payment to bring people out of poverty in the way that Scotland have done so successfully. We have talked about a new impetus for the economy and creating jobs, dispersing prosperity around Wales through the creation of a new development agency for Wales. We have talked about our plans for the health service and the need to cut the waiting times that have grown so much over the years under Labour. We will attack those waiting lists now, bring it down, and then transfer to a new era of preventative health in Wales. So the whole policy agenda is mature, but there's a theme around it too, and that theme is of always putting front and centre what's in the interest of the people of Wales. And it does include, of course, a government led by Plaid Cymru putting pressure on UK government to take action on fair funding, on funding railways in Wales as they should, in a way that Labour has failed to do.
When you talk about your child poverty plans, which are very ambitious, would your government actually have the current powers to deliver them, or would you have to seek some extra powers from Westminster? Well,
both of those. We have powers to find a way of doing it. Now, Scotland have more powers than Wales when it comes to welfare. We don't have those powers, and we make the case to Westminster to give us those powers. What we've done is to find a roundabout way so that we're able to do this in a slightly more complex way, but that hopefully reaches the same aim. But it makes the case, doesn't it, on why we need to find those easier pathways to implementing a payment such as that. I've asked the Labour First Minister for Wales, for example, if she would put pressure on the UK Treasury not to put blocks in the way of us introducing this direct child payment. She hasn't answered that, but it makes the case that we do need to see UK government facilitating this, and surely we wouldn't get a Labour Treasury blocking a direct payment to help some of the poorest people in our communities.
If you had more powers to raise taxes in Wales, would you use them?
I think we have to be ready to think about the balance between the expenditure that we put into public services and what we ask people to pay in. You asked the question in the right way, because we do have some powers over taxation, but we don't have the kind of nuanced, flexible powers that would allow us to use them. For example, to lower tax for lowest income people. We're very clear that we're supportive of a wealth tax, for example. We want to lessen the burden on the people who can least afford it. But currently we don't have the kind of tools that they have in Scotland, for example,
what would your wealth tax look like?
System.
What would your wealth tax look like?
Well, We've suggested a 2% tax on wealth of over £10 million. I think it's the principle that's most importantly here, and asking UK government, because this isn't a power that we have, asking UK government to engage with this, because even millionaires in the UK have come together, many of them in an organisation calling for a fairer taxation system where those with most are able to give a little bit more. We're saying, let's explore this, because we believe it would work, and we think it would allow us to create a more equitable society, or at least start the work.
Now, this is more like your old job of being a political correspondent in Wales. So hopefully you'll be fine with that. The electoral system in Wales is changing next time round, which I think lots of people aren't aware of outside Wales. What does that mean just in theory for how the election goes?
Well, there is a real significance to it. And what it means in theory is that change becomes more possible. There's never been a majority in the history of devolution in Wales, but Labour have had somewhat of an inbuilt bias in the system that we've had, in that there were 40 first past the post seats, Westminster-style elections, the bulk of those in the post-industrial South Wales valleys, and Labour has been able to maintain a significant number of those for the first quarter of a century of devolution, which has enabled them to get at or around half the seats, and they've been able to lead government. Now we have a more proportional system which takes away that inbuilt bias. And there's nothing, I think, that's more of a block to change than people thinking change isn't possible. And for the first time now, they can see that, for example, in Plaid Cymru, there's a party that's united, that has a clear vision and a plan for government, but also they can see a route now to their votes actually counting, and them, by voting Plaid, actually getting a Plaid Cymru government. So I think there's a different mindset around this election. I think you're probably right. Not many people have clocked the detail of how it works yet. But I know from when the first elections were introduced in 1999 with 2 different ballot papers, and as journalists we were thinking, how do we explain this to the electorate? You know what? From the very first election, the Welsh electorate were very sophisticated and started voting one party on one ballot paper, one on another, because they could see the nuances of the system. And I think by May next year, people will understand, hold on, my vote really counts in this election. And so if I want Plaid, I can get Plaid by voting for them.
Right, let's end where we began, talking about your conference. One of the things we learnt when we made a profile of you for the general election last year was that you come from a very musical family. You were in a band called 69. So I'm just wondering, does this weekend and gathering with all your colleagues and activists and friends offer some musical opportunities for you?
You know what? I have never yet taken a guitar to the stage at the Plaid Cymru conference. I think I'll probably give it a miss again this year. I haven't yet taken a guitar to conference, actually. I think I'll be of service to everybody at the conference if I just strum a little bit at home before heading off to get myself in the right headspace and spare them that.
So you're not going to do an Ed Davey style bid for Christmas #1 then, I'm guessing, from that answer.
You've given me an idea now.
Well, I mean, he got quite a lot of publicity for that. And I think, didn't he make it to number 39, I think? So he did get into the top 4. Anyway.
Yeah.
Anyway, as you said, you're taking a vow of silence when it comes to music. Reen, thank you very much, and have a great conference.
Thank you. Good to talk to you.